In this video I'm going to tell you about an experience that I had a few years ago that I believe could really help you deal with the COVID pandemic and the isolation that some of us are experiencing. Hi, my name's Scott McArthur and thank you very much for tuning in to the Edge of Next vlog, where I give you tools and techniques and ideas to help you reach forward into the future of work. My ultimate aim is to put the human back in human resources. If this is your first time here, please hit the subscribe button and hit the little bell, and that will make sure that you're part of the future conversation. One of my favourite poets, Charles Bukowski, once said in one of his most famous poems that isolation was a gift. I wasn't so sure when I spent 10 days with a group of Benedictine monks in a church located in the Scottish Highlands. So a few years ago, when I first started to be a HR professional, it wasn't even called HR, in fact, it was called personnel. People used to take the mickey out of me when I answered the phone and I said, personnel. After having done my training with one of the UK's utility companies called British Gas, the time came when I had to decide on whether or not I wanted to stay there and move slowly through the ranks, or whether I would take a risk and jump out and see if I could get myself a senior role. I decided on the latter, despite the fact that it was a wonderful experience and I would recommend it to anybody if you get a chance to work in that industry. It is fantastic. I appreciate things have changed, but it was terrific. We were a great provider of good service to our customers all over the United Kingdom. And so I took a job in the north of Scotland, not just the north, the very far north of Scotland, and ended up working in the education environment. Now that job had its ups and its downs, and I'm sure I'm going to cover them in the weeks to come on this channel. But one thing that happened was particularly difficult. I was an executive member of the management team there, and to help us with that role we had a board. And like most organisations, we had a non-exec director team, and one of those directors looked after our marketing. This particular individual was a very talented person. He was a very famous person in his particular field, and selling and marketing and development was something he really knew about. Then one day when I came into the office, I heard the terrible news that this chap had passed. Not only that, but he'd actually taken his own life. This was devastating. He wasn't a close friend, he was an acquaintance, but he was somebody that I respected and somebody that I took a lot of pleasure in knowing, because he was a great storyteller and he was very, very wise. So this hit me quite hard. Now, living in a small town in the far north of Scotland is a bit like living on an island. Everybody knows your business, everybody knows your thoughts, your beliefs, your family, your kids, and this chap was no different. But what started to happen was quite disconcerting. No one knew that he was suffering from mental health problems, and no one thought that perhaps he needed help. The rumours went round the town that he was having an affair, that he was drinking too much, that he was murdered. None of these things were true, but it really started to get me down and I didn't quite know how to deal with it. Then one of my friends suggested that I look into getting away for a little while and that I could perhaps go on a retreat. Now, living in the Highlands, there aren't that many options, particularly in the winter, and I could only really find one place where I could go for a retreat nearby where we lived. I had found a group of monks in an abbey called Pluscarden Abbey who welcomed visitors. This was quite worrying because personally I'm an atheist, and the thought of spending time with people with such deep religion and deep religious beliefs in an abbey, for goodness sake, terrified me. However, my friend persuaded me to go. I had visions of 10 days when I was doing things like this and reading the Bible. Fortunately for me, that's not what it was like at all. When I arrived at Pluscarden Abbey, I was welcomed by a monk. Now there's no surprise, but what was quite unusual was he was quite an unusual looking fella. He was a bit like one of those monks in the Name of the Rose film, which you may have seen. He was quite an odd chap. He took me down round the back of the abbey, and there was a cottage, and this would be where I'd be living for the next 10 days. Now, just as I was unpacking my bag and thinking about what this experience would be like, I have to be honest, I felt quite nervous. The monk came back and he said, "Oh, you've been invited to this evening's service, and I must remind you that this is a silent retreat. We do not talk to one another in the abbey unless at certain times where you'll be told you've got permission to speak. So please, after I leave your room, no more talking until someone tells you you're allowed to talk. Now, for those of you who know me and maybe follow me on YouTube, I quite like to talk, so this was quite a scary proposition. 10 days, can you imagine it? 10 days without being able to speak. I was quite worried. I sat in my room and looked at the schedule for the next 10 days for a little while, and then the time came when I had to go over for the evening service. I got my jacket on, came out the door, walked across the little park into the Abbey. The first thing that hit me was it was a beautiful, beautiful place. But the other thing was the noise. Now, these monks are wonderful singers, and as I moved into the Abbey, I noticed that there was 10 or maybe 12 of them down at the front of the cathedral, and one person was at the very, very front. It was the fella who had welcomed me into the Abbey and had taken me to my accommodation. Turns out he was one of the best singers in the group. The music was astonishing, and I sat down, my mouth open, listening to them. I spent the next 10 days attending these vigils on the edge of wilderness, and it was an experience that I will never forget, despite the fact that the daily routine was one where you got up, you went for a very meagre breakfast, which they called the pittance, which was absolutely right. We then spent time gardening, where my mind would race off and I would get lost in thoughts about my life and about the death of my colleague. And then we'd play football, and monks are pretty hard, tough footballers, you know. But again, I did spend a lot of time in my own head, and for the first couple of days, I must be honest and say I found it extremely difficult. When I walked into that Abbey, my head was all over the place. I had no idea what was going on. I didn't really understand how to deal with the death of my colleague. I didn't really know what I was going to do about my job, and it had been such a big part of my life to this point, because I mean I was young and daft, and it was before I had kids and everything changes, and I was pretty ambitious, and despite doing my best to drink away the problem that was the loss of this friend, he was only the second person I ever knew that I'd lost. So it was a fundamental thing. It was a true life moment. So I was agitated, I was nervous, I was unsure, I was like, as they say in Scotland, I was a lost wee boy. Now, I left that Abbey 10 days later. I hadn't converted, I wasn't transformed, I wasn't a different person. But one thing was the case. I was definitely surer about myself, and I felt a little bit better about where I should go in the future. So what's the point of me sharing this story with you in 2020, 2021? What I did notice when I was in that state of self-imposed isolation was that my life experience to that point became increasingly vivid. What does that mean in this case? Well, I think that young man, me, who was in that Abbey, feeling sorry for himself, then seeing his life writ large, vividly in that Abbey, what I was doing there was I was experiencing fear. It was my entry point to fear, having fear in my life, not knowing what to do. And this is where I think we can have a moment to reflect on what's happening now, but frame it in what we've been through in terms of our lived experience. My friend Ian, who I've spoken to here on my channel about all sorts of things, and he's coming back, so we're going to be speaking again quite soon. He suggested to me that I should see some of my stories and some of my history as points of entry, so entry points into my now self and probably my future self. If you follow my work here on YouTube, you'll know that I say that I believe that part of being human is that we're always on the edge of something else. We're always on the edge of a change, of a transformation, of a new thought, a new career, a new relationship. We are on the edge of next, and that is part, as I said, of the human condition. And I realise now that that fear has an implication, has an impact on how I'm feeling about today and the imposed isolation that is lockdown. Now, as she so often does, Pema Chodron says something that really inspires me in this space. She says this, she says, fear was a natural reaction of moving closer to the truth. So as we live through COVID, I'm once again experiencing fear. Fear of uncertainty, fear of my life, fear of my relatives' lives. 2 people I was at school with have died of COVID. But I'm also scared about my reaction to this. I'm scared about my job. All of this is changing. And I realise that the lessons I learnt in that abbey remain important to how I deal with that fear.